so actually, sorry, I'm not very well prepared. How much time do I have? All right. I will speak like 1 hour, I guess, and then I will take questions. Is that right? I hope that's okay. All right, so this is based on this recent work that I've been doing with one of my many collaborators, Laura, who's not here today, fortunately. By the way, in both of our names, the family name precedes the given name. So this is the right order. Anyway, so she should be credited for most of the sort of the interesting bits of this talk. Hope to be able to convey the essential bits in an accessible way. But if I fail, that's going to be my fault. Anyways, so okay, so this is about additivity. And at the beginning, I will give you some sort of background, so introduction to the general topic. If you know this literature, you can sort of zone out for now if you're tired, because this is the last talk. I'll tell you when to come back. So, okay, so it's about the semantics of additive particles, and additive particles are expressions like to and also. So in this talk, I will sort of pretend that there's no difference between the two, which is probably not true. I mean, of course, morphologically they look different, and maybe syntactically too. There might be differences, but I will just to simplify the discussion, I will pretend that there's no difference and mostly talk about examples with two. Okay, and I believe the core intuitions will. So we're going to be talking about English example most of the time, but I think you get the same kind of intuitions in other languages too. So you can check your own native language if you are not a native speaker of English. But if you notice something like the differences, cross-linguistic differences or differences between to and also, I mean, we're very interested in that. Anyway, so yeah, so we want to understand the semantics and pragmatics of expressions like to. So this is an example. Katie is having dinner in New York too. And these particles are said to be focus sensitive in the sense that depending on where you put the focal stress, the main stress in the sentence, you get a different inference, right? So I'm using underscore to indicate focus here. So in one, the intended interpretation is one where Katie is focused, and it kind of sounds like you have something like someone other than Katie is having dinner in New York, right, intuitively. But if you focus something else, like for example, dinner, right? So Katie is having dinner in New York too. You would get a different inference. So in that sense, additive particles are focus sensitive. You get different inferences depending on the focal structure. Now, so that aspect is actually going to be important for our analysis. But what we want to really understand is what the presupposition really sort of consists in, because there's this famous observation by Kripke, right? So here's just to set up a sort of a context. So suppose that you're walking like outside. Some evening, maybe you're in New York, maybe not, but yes, wherever you are, you can't really start your conversation by saying, like, by the way, Katie is having dinner in New York right now too.
Yes,
That's
sir.
extremely weird. Chris, yes, are we having an issue? Sorry, sorry. I'm
yes,
getting,
your slide. Your slide is stuck.
Oh, my slide's not working. I see. Sorry, and I removed my headphones as well. Okay, hold on a second. Sorry about that. Am I using the right thing? Okay. How's this? Is it working?
Good.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, okay. So, yeah. Like, hold on. I need to switch to this. Okay, that's better. Right. So yeah, so additive particles are focus sensitive. You have some kind of inference that looks like this. What's written here? Someone other than Katie is having dinner in New York. Right. So this much is kind of, well, I should talk about Kripke's observation. Wait, what happened? Right. So Kripke made this very famous observation about which shows something about the nature of this presupposition. So you cannot really say Katie is having dinner in New York right now too, out of the blue. And this is very interesting in that if the presupposition, the additive presupposition, were merely existential, it should be fine because it's common knowledge that there is someone other than Katie who's having dinner in New York right now. And there has to be someone, at least one person who's having dinner in New York on a given day, right? So if the presupposition, the additive presupposition was existential, you wouldn't expect this utterance to be that bad, right? So we have to characterize the presupposition in a different way. That was the thought. And what Kripke proposed is that this additive presupposition is anaphoric. And there are actually different ways of cashing this idea out. But here's one way, and this is actually kind of different from what Kripke said himself, but one idea is to say that if you have this sentence, Katie is having dinner in New York right now too, the additive presupposition somehow contains an anaphor. So I represent it with this little pro because it doesn't have a phi feature, right? And so it denotes someone other than Katie, and that person is having dinner in New York right now. That's the additive presupposition, according to this idea. And the thing is, this is not an existential statement, and it contains an anaphor, so you have to resolve this anaphora. But we know the pronominal anaphora is very hard to resolve out of the blue, right? So you, for example, you cannot really just say he's having dinner in New York without specifying who he is. Right, so according to Kripke, that's basically the reason why it's bad to say Katie's having dinner in New York right now too, out of the blue. Okay, and again, so Kripke didn't really sort of formally implement this idea, but then there are later works that kind of tried to do that. And this idea is very interesting because if this is true, then we have to conclude that at least some presuppositions are not merely propositional in the classical sense of propositional. Right? You can't characterize this meaning in terms of sets of possible worlds. You have to say that there's something about, well, you have to somehow encode this anaphoric dimension of meaning in the presupposition. So that, and I think this has been, this idea or this approach has been the standard in the literature, even today. It's not that there aren't other ideas, but I think this has been still very popular. There are two notes, sorry, in the interest of time, I'm not gonna dwell on this, but Kripke actually had a slightly different version of this analysis because he said that the anaphora is actually a propositional anaphora here. So the idea is that even though it's Katie that is focused, the presupposition itself is anaphoric in a way. So you have to find an antecedent proposition in the discourse. Okay, that was the version that he had in mind, but in later work, other people proposed this kind of localized versions. But I'm not going to talk about the propositional version for reasons of time. And I will present this other version because I think that's more flexible. This I will just skip, but Kripke actually had another argument for the anaphoric analysis, which comes from this example in 4, but I think this actually doesn't give you a good argument anyway. This is probably an orthogonal phenomenon, as this guy Eddie Rouse argues in his paper. I think Rouse really I think that's how it's pronounced, first of all, his name. But I think he's very convincing in this regard. So if you're interested, you can read his paper. Okay, so that's the background. So here's the new stuff. So you should come back if you are zoning out. Okay, so we want to argue first against the anaphoric theory of additive presuppositions, because it makes the following prediction, namely restrictions on accommodation of additive presupposition should be the same restrictions that you have for accommodation of pronominal reference. I mean, this is the core idea, right? These two phenomena are the same thing. That was the Kripkean idea here. But we'll see that it turns out empirically that pronominal reference actually is more constrained, generally speaking. And there are actually cases where you can accommodate additive presuppositions. And that gives rise to this question, like, how do we understand this difference? So we will conclude that these two types of accommodation are constrained in different ways. So we're going to try to have a different theory. So that's the second bit of the talk. And in particular, we will propose the following view. So our idea is that there are two processes that you have to do when you try to interpret an additive particle. First, you have to identify contextually relevant focus alternatives, because remember, additive particles are focus sensitive. And it's not actually overtly indicated what the relevant alternatives are in a given context or in a given utterance containing an additive particle. So you have to accommodate these relevant focus alternatives. Then you use them to compute your additive presupposition. So there are actually two things to do here, right? You first identify focus alternatives and then compute an additive presupposition. And that additive presupposition might or might not have to be accommodated. And if you have to accommodate it, you should accommodate it. And what we want to argue is that that's all you have to say to understand Kripke's observation. In particular, we don't think that there's anything special about accommodation of the additive presupposition. It should be regulated in the same way as accommodation of other presuppositions. So what makes additive presuppositions sort of look special is actually the first component. You have this focus business going on, and that requires the separate process of accommodating contextually relevant alternatives, and that's constrained in a slightly different way, and that's why you get something like Kripke's observation. So that's the view. If there's time, and there won't be time, I'm almost certain about this, but there are very interesting cases of focused quantifiers associating with additive particles. So if some miracle happens and I have time to talk about them, I will, but let's see. Okay, so first let me talk about sort of problems of the anaphoric view. Oh, actually, by the way, in addition to these two theories, there's a third theory, which is due to Laus. He has a different theory, but we don't have time to talk about it. Flora and I have been revising the paper version of this talk, and there we talk about his theory as well, in case you're interested. Okay, so good. So we want to argue against the anaphoric theory first, and our empirical criticisms come from cases where you can accommodate the additive presupposition. So let's look at some examples or exceptions. So already in the literature, you can find some examples where the additive presupposition can actually be accommodated, unlike in Kripke's original example. And we can actually make a generalization, which is that generally speaking, when the additive presupposition is about some indexical element, so like something like the speaker or the hearer or the current location and so on, then generally speaking, accommodation is easy. So I'll give you an example just now. So suppose that you're having dinner in New York yourselves, right? So say you go to a buffet restaurant. I think that's what this picture is about. And you're in New York, right? You're having dinner in New York. And then you can start your conversation by just saying, by the way, Katie is having dinner in New York right now too. That's, I think, completely fine, right? So here, the antecedent, in a way, I mean, if you are to apply the anaphoric theory, the antecedent of the pronominal component of the presupposition is we, because we are having dinner in New York. You might say, okay, so this is not really out of the blue, but if you think about it, there's no such thing as like a completely null context. I mean, it's out of the blue in the sense that it's the first utterance of the conversation. And it's, so what seems to be licensing the accommodation here is this contextual information that you are having dinner in New York yourselves. And if you think about it, Kripke implicitly assumes that you are not having dinner in New York, right? In order to get Kripke's judgment, you actually have to assume that. And then, so in such a situation, indeed, the sentence is infelicitous. You can't accommodate the presupposition. Right. Good. And it seems to us that generally speaking, when the antecedent, so to speak, is about you, me, we, here, now, and things like that, accommodation is generally easy. So here are some more examples. The first example is from Laos. You can start you can just tell someone who's like, I don't know what the context really is meant to be, but say, I don't know, a child is bullying a kitten or something. I mean, you can go to the child and say, hey, that kitten has feelings too, you know? So again, the intended antecedent here is like something like us humans or something like that, right? So there's this indexical component, and maybe it's like it's actually just the kid, if it's a kid. I would skip the example in 7, which is from the lyrics of Sting's song in the current situation. I think it's kind of inappropriate to talk about it, so I'll skip it. But it's the same thing. It seems to have some kind of indexical component. The third example is from Grubich's paper. And again, it's the same thing, but so you see a woman at a bus stop on a rainy day, and a car drives by, splashing this woman with muddy water. And to that woman, you can say, oh, one splashed me this morning too. And the intended antecedent, so to speak, is this woman in front of you. Okay, so that's the hearer. So in all of these cases, accommodation seems to be pretty easy, and the intended antecedent is either the speaker or a group including the speaker or the hearer. We constructed cases that involve time and place as antecedents. So like if you go to a cafe with a friend in the afternoon, you can tell them, you know, I came here this morning too. Again, it's easy to accommodate the presupposition that the additive presupposition is about now, right? And similarly for 10, where the additive presupposition about here, but we'll just skip that because it's the same thing. So that's so these examples really show that accommodation of additive presuppositions actually is not that difficult. We still need to understand why Kripke's original example was not good, but at least it's possible to accommodate additive presuppositions. One interesting thing is that it's actually, you don't need indexical content license accommodation. So here are some cases where you don't seem to have indexable elements in the additive presupposition. So if both of these are from Klaus again, and this paper is really good, by the way, if you haven't read it. He has like very interesting examples. So in this example, this is a dialogue, and so the dean of, I don't know, student affairs or something says, do PhD students even have families to take care of? And the student rep says, sure, PhD students have families too. Again, you have two. And I don't really know what the intended reading is supposed to be. Maybe it's the additive presupposition is about, I don't know, professors plus other members of staff of the university, or maybe it's about, I don't know, people in their late 20s, early 30s in the real world. So I don't know, but whichever way, the dean actually doesn't need to be part of the antecedent presupposition, right? So it can be known that, well, actually that's maybe possible interpretation too, but you don't need to involve you as in the additive presupposition. And same for 12. So here there's a guard for some kind of like a garden. And the guard says, I'm sorry, small children are not allowed to enter. And there's this child who says, that's not fair. I deserve the right to enter the garden too. And I suppose the antecedent here is either just big children who can, right, older children who can enter the garden, or maybe children and adults, older children and adults. So again, I don't know what the intended interpretation really is, but here too, you can accommodate the additive presupposition, right? And this example is super nice. I want to read it. So Sam used to be really poor, which made him feel ostracized and lonely. But now that Sam has struck it rich, he no longer feels alone. Now he too can drive a Mercedes and have dinner in fancy restaurants in New York. And notice that there's no mention of other people really, although their existence is, or the relevance is sort of implied, and that's probably relevant here in licensing the accommodation. But the thing is, you don't need to really mention these people overtly, but you can still say two. Right? It's very natural to say two here. Okay, so finally, I tried to construct some like minimal pairs. Just to give you an announcement, I got into SALT actually this year. I mean, I made these examples before I got into SALT, but I got into SALT actually, and it's in Mexico. I hope I can go. Anyways, so if a phonologist friend comes to your office, they cannot really ask you, did you get into SALT too? It's kind of like, it has the same feeling as Kripke's original example. I mean, we actually changed the original example, but you know what I mean? Whereas if a semanticist friend comes to your office and asks, did you get into SALT too? You can sort of accommodate the presupposition that the speaker, the questioner got into SALT. I mean, it's a sort of bad, a rude way of announcing that you got into SALT, but you could do that. And notice here that you have to accommodate, well, yeah, you have to accommodate to this additive presupposition, right? It's new information that the speaker got into SALT. And then they are asking if you got into SALT as well. The third case is a non-indexical version. So suppose that a phonologist friend comes to your office with a semanticist friend. So someone who you know is a semanticist, so say Katie. And the phonologist friend asks, did you get into SALT too? You can sort of accommodate the presupposition that it's about Katie. Right, so Katie got into SALT. Okay, so the bottom line is you can accommodate additive presuppositions in some cases. And if the additive presupposition is about indexical things, It's often easy, but it's not necessary to have an indexical component, like in this final. Well, it's kind of indexical maybe, but Gauss's examples, for example, are not really about indexicals. Okay, so that's the empirical landscape, right? And now we want to argue against the anaphoric theory. And so our criticism is kind of easy. That is, we want to compare how pronominal reference, pronominal anaphora works in the same kind of environments, right? So again, just to remind you, the core idea behind the anaphoric theory is that additive presuppositions and pronominal reference, pronominal anaphora, are constrained in the same way with respect to accommodation, right? But we will observe that pronominal anaphora cannot be accommodating in certain contexts where additive presupposition can be. Okay, so let me give you some examples. I'm a bit worried about time, so I will kind of rush a little bit. But so this is the same example as before from Gauss. So now he too can drive a Mercedes, blah, blah, blah. And this is perfectly fine. And the intended antecedent, as it were, here is something like his friends or his rich friends or people in his circle, whatever, right? I think that's the intended reading. But you cannot have a pronoun referring to these people. So 17 is the example in point. So you have the exact same lead-in context description, right? It's the exact same thing. So he no longer feels alone. You cannot really say he hangs out with them in Manhattan all the time or like every day or whatever. Like you can't really say they to refer to these people. Okay. So I think the contrast here is pretty stark, showing that this accommodation in 13 of the additive presupposition is pretty easy, whereas you can't accommodate the referent of a pronoun. You can make the same point with this dean-student conversation. So recall, you can say, sure, PhD students have families too, fine, and you're referring to maybe professors. You cannot use the pronoun in the same context to refer to professors. So that's in 18. So the same utterance by the dean. Do PhD students even have families to take care of? You cannot really say, do you think only they have families? Like it's like, what are you talking about? So, and we can make more examples of this kind, but for reasons of time, I will just conclude. So I think these examples show that accommodation of additive presuppositions is less constrained somehow than accommodation of pronominal anaphora. Of course, we want to understand why. We're not giving you a theory of pronominal anaphora in this talk or in our paper. So we're not going to say much about how pronominal anaphora works. I mean, at the end of the day, of course, we want to understand it. But we will try to say something about how additive presuppositions can be accommodated in some context. Okay. In addition, just to mention, the anaphoric theory makes problematic predictions for cases where quantifiers are focused. But I guess I don't have time to talk about this today. But I don't know. If we had been all in Tokyo, we could, I don't know, go somewhere to talk about this some other day. Okay, good. So that's our major criticism against the anaphoric theory, right? It seems like accommodation of the additive presupposition is somehow easier than accommodation of pronominal anaphora. So we probably need to understand these two phenomena differently. So how do we do that? So we're not really giving you a theory of pronominal anaphora, but we're going to try to argue for a particular view of how accommodation of additive presuppositions works. Okay, and here we will crucially refer to focus. So let's see. So it's now 8:50 for me. So yeah, that should be fine. Okay, so this is our main idea. So forget about the anamorphic theory. It's over. Now this is our idea. So again, recall that additive particles are focus sensitive. So there's this focus business to take care of. And we argue that, first of all, when you see a focus, so when you see an additive particle, you have to identify contextually relevant focus alternatives. Okay, so that's one thing you have to do. And then you compute the additive presupposition based on these focus alternatives. And you might or might not have to accommodate that presupposition, right? And we argue that these two processes, or the interplay between these two processes, explains Kripke's original observation, as well as seeming exceptions to this. Okay, so that's the rough idea. So let me give you some more details. So again, I think it's uncontroversial that additive particles are focus sensitive. So we want to understand how focus works. I don't have time, a lot of time to really introduce this kind of like the basic machinery of the semantics of focus, but let me just declare that we're going to assume alternative semantics, which means that when you have a focus item, it introduces some alternatives. And we're going to assume a particular version of this idea where focus alternatives are linguistic expressions. And this is going to give us a nice sort of a... So we actually treating this idea as like sort of an off-the-shelf version of a theory of alternatives in a way. So we're not really married to it, but I think it's going to give us a very nice way of understanding how to account for the present phenomenon. So I'll come back to this point. But here's an example. Oh, and the set of alternatives is contextually restricted, and that's a common assumption in focus semantics. So here's an example. So let's take some example context. I'm not going to really specify it, but if you have a sentence, Katie danced, where Katie is focused, you have alternatives like Katie danced, James danced, Flora danced, and so on. And all of these are meant to be expressions, and they have some meaning, right? And this is somehow contextually restricted, so you don't have, in this particular context, C, you don't have other sentences like, I don't know, Chris danced or Aviv danced, and so on. In a different context, you might have those sentences too. So we're going to assume this theory of alternatives due to Fox and Katsir. Their underlying, well, their main claim is that the alternatives that you use for focus are derived in the same way as alternatives for scalar impliciatures in general. I'm not going to really say why they think so. You can read their paper about this because I don't have a lot of time here. But what's nice about this is that you can postulate some structural constraints on what could be possible alternatives. And that's really Katsir's point about implicatures. And then Fox and Katsir extended this idea to focus alternatives. So there's some structural constraints on what counts as a good alternative. Okay, and this is kind of nice for our view because we can, essentially what we're going to say is that you can use that linguistic knowledge, as it were, to enable accommodation. That's going to help you identify contextually relevant alternatives for an additive particle. So that's where we are going. Anyway, so yeah, we can have some constraints on what counts as a good alternative. And here's so this is a bit too complex, but this is what's assumed by focus and consider. I don't know if you can really follow me here, but let me quickly go over this. If you don't understand this, it's fine. I think you will understand it by looking at some examples later on. But anyway, so the idea is that you can construct alternatives from a given sentence by either replacing the focus element with a lexical item, or you can make a smaller version of the focus item. That's the second operation here. Or you can take something from the context and use it in place of the focus item. So the general idea is that if you have a sentence with a focus in it, you can replace the focus element with one of these three things. Okay, that's a rough idea. I'm not going to really dwell on the formulation here. So here's some examples. So if you have Katie danced, right? So you can replace Katie with a lexical item according to this operation. So you can have something like James danced because James is a lexical item. You can also have Chris danced or whatever, Yasu danced. But crucially, you cannot really have James and Andy danced because this is not a replacement with a lexical item. It's a replacement with a phrase. You could have it actually if this expression is contextually salient. Then you can take it from the context and use it instead of Katie. Right. 23 is not that relevant for us, so this is meant to be a case of simplification. So you can take a sub-constituent, but this is not going to be that relevant for us. I will skip that. So assuming this, this version of alternative semantics as a theory of focus, we're going to propose the following semantics for the additive particle 2. So if you have two, so if you have two phi for some sentence, phi with the focus in it, it gives you an additive presupposition such that, so for each alternative that's contextually relevant, that is not already entailed by phi, you have to make sure that that alternative is true. You might have something to say about this universal quantification, and we can talk about it later. We think that this is a better formulation than existential version of this, as it were, which we have tried actually. But anyway, I'll tell you more about this. I will actually, so today, for reasons of time, I will focus on cases where two, or I kind of pretend that two takes a sentential scope like this, but it's actually not a necessary assumption. Technically speaking, you can always type generalize this, but that's a bit technically complicated, so I will omit that here. So here's an example. If you have Katie dance 2, right? So you're going to identify the contextually relevant alternatives. So let's say in this particular context, C, James dance is relevant. Then you derive the additive presupposition according to this semantic recipe. So here, Katie dance is already entailed by the sentence here. So the additive presupposition will amount to just James danced. Okay, fine. Notice that whenever you hear two, you actually have to accommodate what the relevant alternatives are, because I think you never actually overtly specify by linguistic means what the alternatives are. In some cases, it's contextually clear that what the alternatives are meant to be, but still you still have to accommodate these alternatives. Right, so this accommodation of relevant focus alternatives is a necessary process every time you see an additive particle. So in a case like 25, where you have a preceding sentence, it's kind of obvious, right? So if you hear James danced and Katie danced too, it's obvious that what's intended is that the relevant focus alternative is James danced. So fine, you can do that. And pragmatically speaking, right, it's easy for the hearer to guess that this is the intended alternative and the only one here. And also the speaker should be able to expect that the hearer can identify this as the relevant alternative, right? So pragmatically, it's fine to use to here in a way, because you can expect your hearer to be able to process this. But that's not always the case. Sorry, no, one more detail before going to a bad example. You might actually have multiple options. So if you have something like James and Andy Downs, Katie Downs too. So what are the relevant alternatives? It might actually be that there's only one alternative, James and Andy Downs, right? Which is fine. Or it's maybe actually two alternatives, James Downs and Andy Downs, or maybe just one of them, James Downs. Or you could have all three of these if you wanted to. So there are several options here. So maybe you can't really uniquely identify what the relevant alternatives are, what the relevant set is. But in a way, pragmatically speaking, it doesn't really matter probably. So maybe that's what our thought here is, that that's maybe what's licensing to here. So again, if you're the hearer, you have to accommodate the set of relevant alternatives here. It's kind of obvious that it's one of these options, and pragmatically speaking, any of them will do, because the resulting additive presupposition is going to be satisfied. So it's kind of like, it doesn't matter. And the speaker should be aware of this state of affairs, right? That this would be what the hearer would have to do if after the utterance. So this is fine. I mean, you have multiple options, but so like it doesn't matter. However, if you think about Kripke's example, right? So Kripke is out of the blue context. Katie is having dinner in New York too. Why is it bad? Well, again, you have to identify the intended set of alternatives. But notice that you have some constraints on what kind of alternatives you can have here. So first of all, contextually, there's no salient expression. And this is a very simple expression. So all you can do is basically replace this with a lexical item, something like another proper name. Then you're going to have things like Katie's having dinner in New York, plus James is having dinner in New York, or maybe Andy's having dinner in New York, or maybe both of these and so on. But so you have many potential candidate sets of alternatives, but they all give rise to different additive presuppositions. I mean, not all of them actually, but you see what I mean? So you don't know. So the problem here is that you don't know which set of alternative is intended and which additive presupposition to accommodate or to evaluate even. And so we think that that's the problem. So this is essentially a pragmatic issue of identifying or accommodating the relevant set of focus alternatives. It's not a problem about presupposition accommodation, crucially for us, right? So Kripke said this is about accommodating the presupposition. No, what we are saying is this is about accommodating a set of focus alternatives. You're not indicating which sentences or which expressions are relevant here. And those different options that are allowed by the mechanism give rise to different additive presuppositions. And you don't know which one is really intended. So that's the problem, according to us. Okay, so I think I just said what I wanted to say, but let me repeat, because this is important. I think I personally think that this is kind of right. I usually don't think so about my own analysis, but I think this is kind of right. I mean, this is Flora's idea, I guess. But anyways, so these are the major points. So first, whenever you use an additive particle as a speaker, you're forcing your hearer to accommodate some set of alternatives, right? That's a necessary component. This accommodation is pragmatically constrained, but in a way, every type of accommodation is pragmatically constrained with respect to, basically the hearer needs to be able to identify the relevant set of alternatives, and also the speaker should be sure that the hearer can do that. Otherwise, you shouldn't force your hearer to accommodate a particular set of alternatives. But what's nice about this view that could lead to an understanding of the difference between accommodation of additive presuppositions versus accommodation of pronominal anaphora is that we're using different kinds of information as sort of clues as to what the intended thing that needs to be accommodated is, right? So for focus alternatives, we are assuming that they are linguistic expressions and there are some constraints like structural complexity that constrain what's a possible alternative. So you can actually use that knowledge in resolving your accommodation puzzle. Whereas for pronominal anaphora, pretty much all you have is the 5 features, if any, of the pronoun, right? And that's probably a different sort of a way of dealing with this kind of issue. So again, we're not really talking about how pronominal anaphora works or how accommodation of pronominal antecedents works. So that's sort of a secondary thing for us. But okay. So this is essentially our view. Now let me say a bit more about how those exceptional cases work, right? Where you can actually accommodate the additive presupposition. Okay, good. So here are some more details. So first of all, we have actually a lot of flexibility with respect to what counts as an alternative, theoretically speaking. In particular, so in cases like 28, one boy danced, Katie danced, 2, you actually probably don't want to use a proper name as your alternative, because that's not going to give you, I mean, unless, so if your alternative is James danced, the additive presupposition is that James danced, but that might or might not be satisfied. In particular, it's not really guaranteed by the first sentence here. But the intuition here is that this first sentence can somehow satisfy or filter out, if you like, the presupposition, the additive presupposition here. So how is that possible? Well, we could say that in this case, you have a pronominal alternative, like he danced, right? So this expression itself is not used, but he is in the lexicon and it's pretty simple. So why don't you just use it to replace Katie to get this sentence? And this sentence is true in this context. If you resolve he to one boy, right? But in theory, you should be able to do that. So you could have pronominal alternatives like this in theory, especially because pronouns are cross-linguistically very simple. So they are, and they're lexical items. So you can, and also very, very frequent. So they're very likely to be intended in terms of frequency. However, in an out of the blue context, you still have to resolve this anaphora if you use the pronoun, right? So you wouldn't use a pronominal anaphora in an out of the blue context. So this is not an option in the Kripke context. But if you have an appropriate antecedent, you could use it. One nice sort of consequence of this is that in the case of indexical pronouns, you don't actually need a discourse antecedent, right? So you can just say we out of the blue, or you, or I, or whatever. And we think, and those are very frequent items, first of all, plus their reference are super salient usually. So those indexical cases are super easy to accommodate. And that we think that explains our earlier observation that indexical, or what looks like indexical additive presuppositions are easy to accommodate. So here's an example where you are having dinner in New York, right? And you start your conversation by saying, hey, by the way, Katie is having dinner in New York too. Here, the intended antecedent, or the intended focus alternative, I should say focus alternative now instead of antecedent, is we are having dinner in New York, right? So you replace Katie with we, basically. Again, you might have multiple possibilities here, but I think the differences are not that important for, pragmatically speaking. Okay, so that's good. So indexical cases can be understood this way. Right? They're easy because you're replacing your focus item with something that's very frequent, first of all, and in this particular case, well, in all of the examples that I discussed, you know that the additive presupposition computed with this indexical alternative will be satisfied. So that's probably the one that's intended. Here's a slightly different case where you do this kind of accommodation of an indexical focus alternative, but the additive presupposition is not satisfied yet. Right? So here's the example in illustrating this. So a semantics friend, Katie, maybe comes to your office and asks, "Did you get into SALT too?" Right? So suppose that there's no other salient individuals, you can reason that the intended focus alternative is I, because there's no other really relevant expression. So you derive this focus alternative, I got into SALT. But the additive presupposition computed with this, namely this semanticist got into SALT, is not satisfied yet. So you have to accommodate it. So this is a case of double accommodation, right? You accommodate the focus alternative, and then you accommodate the additive presupposition as well. This is different from the previous case where you replace Katie with we, because you know that you are having dinner in New York right now. It's happening in front of you. So there you don't need to accommodate the additive presupposition, it's satisfied. Here, this additive presupposition is new information, you have to accommodate it. So probably empirically, these two cases behave differently. That's what we expect. We don't have a very good sort of testing ground for this at the moment. We probably need some kind of experimental measures to see the difference between these two cases. But intuitively, I kind of feel like there is a difference. So I think this is the right kind of view. Finally, let me talk about this example from Klaus, because this is in a way a problem for everyone, and I have to admit that we don't have a complete theory of this yet, but here's the idea. So you have this context, right? Some used to be really poor, which made him feel ostracized and lonely, but now that somehow structurally rich, he no longer feels alone. Now he too can drive a Mercedes and so on. So to account for this, what we need in our theory, first of all, is to accommodate something like other rich people, or like maybe his like people in his circle or something like that. But that's right. But that cannot be derived by lexical substitution. So we probably have to resort to some notion of contextual saliency, right? So the idea is that this context description makes an expression like this very salient, so you can use it. That's a thought. Again, we admit that we don't have a very pretty theory of what makes this possible. But one thing to note is that if this is what's happening, we'd expect the same thing to be possible in the case of implicatures, because according to Fox and Katzir, you use the same alternatives. right? In the case of implicature. So here's in a way an attempt to check this. With respect to what's called an ad hoc implicature. So you have the same context description. So Sam has struck it rich. He no longer feels alone, yet he knows what it's like to be poor. And the intended interpretation is that other rich people don't know what it's like to be poor. So you have this kind of exhaustive implicature coming from this. So if this is, I mean, okay, so this kind of inference feels very weak anyways, so maybe it's not that convincing. So this is something that we are still trying to figure out. So admittedly, this part of the talk is not really complete, but this is the thought. Right. So okay, good. But so in a way, what the kind of theory we want to have is, right. So this kind of context description, I mean, it's obvious that it kind of like connotes the existence of or relevance of other people, right? It's like Sam is feeling ostracized and lonely, like that's about basically not having other people around, or if he's alone, right? This kind of thing somehow allows you to come up with an expression like this. That's the thought. Crucially, it's very different. This is not enough to license pronomial anaphora, right? So you cannot say, he no longer feels alone, he hangs out with them. That just doesn't work. So pronomial anaphora doesn't work this way, but so the hope here is that somehow by talking about relevant expressions, we might be able to solve this issue. But okay, again, this is sort of like a little bit open here. Okay, so that's the core of our proposal. Let me remark one more, give you a sort of interesting sort of point, which is that, so I've been talking about accommodation of focus alternatives, but notice that you might have to do a similar kind of accommodation when you see other focus sensitive phenomena. For example, only, right? So let's take something like, I should have underlined Katie, but only Katie is having dinner in New York. That's a grammatical sentence. And here too, you have to accommodate some set of alternatives, right? So the process here is essentially the same. And we observe that in this case, as well, you can get the same kind of implicity as Kripke's original case, which people haven't really discussed before. So suppose that you're having dinner in New York yourselves. And if someone says out of the blue, only Katie is having dinner in New York, that's extremely weird, right? Because it's, again, I think the feeling is the same. It's like, who are you talking about? Like, who else are you talking about, right? Because in this context, it's clear that the we is not a relevant alternative because you are having dinner in New York. So you can't be the alternative here, right? So you have to accommodate some other alternative, and that's bad. If you're not having dinner in New York, potentially you could use this indexical alternative. So you can sort of say only Katie is having dinner in New York. And the inference is that you're not having dinner in New York. Sort of. So this is somehow a little bit better. So we think that this is very similar to the Kripke example plus our version of it, except that the context reverses because of the inference that only derives versus the inference versus the additive presupposition. So one thing that we want to stress about this is that this accommodation of focus alternatives is a general phenomenon. It's not specific to additive presuppositions. In theory, all focused particles or focus sensitive phenomena in general, more generally, may trigger such accommodation. Okay. So is this the end of the, so let me summarize. So I will stop now. All right. So again, so our underlying idea is this: there are two processes involved here. One is accommodation of contextually relevant focus alternatives, and then you compute an additive presupposition according to them, and you might or might not have to accommodate the additive presupposition. But we want to stress that neither of these aspects is really special in a way. Like they are both parts of more general phenomena, right? Namely, so for A, we expect the same thing to happen with all other focus-sensitive phenomena, unless somehow the alternatives are grammatically specified by linguistic means. I mean, in which case you wouldn't have to accommodate, but in other cases you have to accommodate, like in this only example. The second thing about the computation of an additive presupposition and potential accommodation of it, that's also not a special phenomenon, not specific to additive presupposition. This is part of the general phenomenon of presupposition and presupposition accommodation. So there's really nothing special about additive particles. That's the view. So let me skip this quantifier stuff. Too bad. So that's same summary. So one important theoretical implication here. Okay. So according to our view, we're not resorting to anaphoric presuppositions, right? We don't need to say that there's an anaphoric component in the presupposition. Our additive presupposition is actually completely propositional. Then we should reconsider this claim that at least some presuppositions are anaphoric, right? Because our theory basically opens up the possibility that there's no such thing as anaphoric presuppositions. And it seems to us that that's maybe the case, right? It looks like, I mean, in the sense that we don't seem to have a phenomenon that's restricted in the same way as pronomina anaphora in the domain of presuppositions. So in that sense, we think that there's no such thing as anaphoric presuppositions. If you're interested, I can tell you more about other presupposition triggers, but that's basically the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. Let's go ahead to questions.
I can take questions. I don't know if I guess Chris were the first. All right.
Yeah, Chris.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Thanks, Yasu. That was a great talk. No surprises there. And I have to duck out in 8 minutes for a meeting. So thanks for giving me the first question. Okay. So many things, but here maybe it's minor, but you know your problematic example, I think it was 13, your John makes out good and buys a Mercedes example or whatever. So I was thinking about it, and I have this hunch that maybe the two there is kind of funny. Like, you know, it's in this funny position. It's right after he, which is not the canonical place to put two. And I feel like my judgment of this sentence degrades a lot if I put two sort of where you might expect it to go. And I'll also note that also seems bad here. So I think it might be that there's a special kind of construction with two where you stick it right after the subject or right on the noun instead of its sort of more distant position. And it might have slightly different properties. Like it might be a boring thing, but it might end up, I just have this hunch that this is a special construction. Like I think of it as like I can imagine advertisements that say, now you too can have your own driver, the new Tesla. You don't have to touch the wheel. And like, that's the way they would say it. They'll say you too.
Right.
And
that
so I kind of wonder.
Extremely interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, it's not really a question, but a possible comment that you might be able to like defang this counterexample and have to have a slight tiny theory of this one little construction. But yeah, anyway. That's it.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. I mean, I wonder what's going on because like it's not obvious what the semantic difference is between this two and the post version. So that's I didn't know about this actually. I someone remarked about it also actually and said basically the same thing. But yeah, so at this point, we don't have a way to account for these differences among different versions of additive particles, but that's extremely interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, obviously double check that with other English speakers,
Sure,
but just my own immediate intuition.
Yeah, I don't trust you.
No, you definitely have the right judgment not to trust me. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Right, bye.
Bye.
Okay, Julie Gontero has a question.
Yes,
for you.
thank you so much for the talk. Very interesting. If I understood it correctly, you're arguing not only that additive presuppositions are not anaphoric, you're also arguing that they're not presuppositions. They are less than presuppositions. They're something like scale implicatures. And in this respect, I just wanted to mention, because you were talking about only at the end, I'm probably you're aware, but I'll just say it's that recently Luca Chernish showed, or at least tried to argue, that the presupposition of only is not a presupposition, but an implicature. So this kind of comes aligned with what you're saying, like using almost the same kind of examples that you're using. So that goes absolutely the same direction. I was wondering if you could talk about the behavior of the additive presuppositions under negation. So it does not project, right? Under negation, PhD students don't have families too. The additive presupposition does not project the positive. And
so,
then
good,
and then in under negative quantifying, nobody in this class has a family too. Also gives rise, like implicatures, to an existential presupposition rather than to a universal presupposition, like normal presuppositions do, right? Nobody in this class stops smoking, projects the universal, and then then implicatures project existential. This is from I think Spector's work. So the reason I'm asking you what you think about that is the following. We know that 2 does not intervene with licensing of stranded guys. And if we kind of assume Gajewski's story for stranded guy licensing, or Dierke's 2013 story for that, we know that either presuppositions or scale implicatures intervene. And 2 seem to be somehow feel special there. So
so Julia, I think there's a lot of things. So let me unpack a little bit, because so there are many things you mentioned that are very interesting. So thank you very much. So first of all, I'm not sure if I understood what you said about the implicature versus presupposition. So our view is that the 2 does have a presupposition, does trigger a presupposition. For only, we're not saying much. So it's possible that this inference about the truth of the prejacent is indeed an implicature, but I'll be fine with that. But for the additive presupposition of 2, I think we have enough evidence to think that it's a presupposition. Okay, so that's and you can reply to that later. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, so about negative contexts. So English has this weird business with 2 versus either, right? Which needs to be understood. Okay, and so that's something to keep in mind when we talk about negative examples. Another relevant factor with respect to your examples involving negative items is focus projection. So I on purpose didn't talk about focus projection, but you have to worry actually about having the entire thing in focus, because this notion of focus actually is kind of abstract. It doesn't necessarily correlate with the pronunciation, especially in English, right? If you focus the object or the last thing in the object DP, you actually have multiple possibilities with respect to what's under focus. And if you have 2 under negation, the scope of 2 actually might be higher than the negation with focus projection. And usually English probably doesn't allow to occur, take scope below negation. You probably have to say either. Of course, this is not the case in language like Russian. So maybe that's a better language to look at. So I really don't understand how either works, or how to, what the distribution of two is with respect to negative stuff. This actually is an interesting thing on its own right. So I don't think your examples are really showing us that two is under the relevant negative item. So that's my answer. So it might be taking scope over the negation. If you see what I mean. Finally, about NPI licensing, I think that's actually not that relevant for us, because we're saying that two doesn't affect the assertion. And if you take the view that assertion is the downward intellingness or negativity in the assertive domain is enough to license NPIs, that's it. The prediction is that two shouldn't interact with it, with NPI licensing. Of course, maybe for certain phenomena, presuppositions like strong NPIs, presuppositions might interfere. So if you have like a specific examples, I'd love to know. But yeah, that's my answer.
Okay, thank you. I think I do have replies, but we can continue on Slack, because I want to
that would be
give
great.
the floor to other people. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you for answering that.
Okay, this talk has brought me back to the days of my dissertation, because this is accommodation was a big part of what I was thinking about then. And one of the things that I thought at the time was that the focus requires a discourse antecedent. And I know that's not true, but it does require a salient antecedent, as you mentioned. But you've got an explanation here that I think is going a little bit too far. You said that if you're here can figure out what the alternative is, that should be good enough. And I think that's wrong. And an example shows it would be something like this. I can't just start off a conversation out of the blue with, the sun is a heavenly body that looks roughly the size of a 500 yen coin held at arm's length too. But I can expect you to be able to figure out that there's only one other thing that from Earth has that size, which is namely the moon, right? If I'm actually talking about the moon like that, then that would be good enough. Being in the presence of the moon by itself doesn't seem to be good enough, even though the moon would be salient. But being in the presence of somebody holding a 500 yen coin up to the moon without any actual conversation going on would, I think, be enough to make that a sentence that you could utter. Right? So the salience, it's, can you get from the salient context, including discourse context, but also visual context, can you accommodate from that an antecedent that would satisfy your restrictions by focus restrictions, right?
That's a very interesting example. So my reaction, my initial reaction to the second case where you are holding up a coin, that might be a case of indexical alternative, because like that could be the relevant expression could just be that, essentially, right? Right. And then maybe that's why it feels easy. But indeed, I mean, we want to understand why the first case isn't so good, even though it's kind of obvious that moon is the relevant noun.
Right, and even when the moon is there, but nobody is doing anything with coins, it's still really difficult.
So So I guess like the question really boils down to what's happening in this example by Klaus. Why is this okay? But like Chris Davis said, maybe there's something special about this second position too, in a way. I wonder if you could construct a version like with this kind of two of your example, and if that's better.
Let me go
Yeah.
back. I'm sorry, I got off of the page that I needed to be able to see this. So yeah, so the sun too is a heavenly body that looks roughly the size of a 500 yuan coin held at arm's length.
Yeah, it's still feels the same.
Yeah,
I see. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so yeah, okay. So maybe after all, maybe you need to say something that's, well, yeah, no, that's a good, yeah.
Actively part of I don't know. I used to think actively part of the discourse, but the fact that this is just an action and still an action that can be used for accommodating. Maybe what it does is it makes it possible to accommodate discourse, and you really do have to refer to discourse, and you can't just accommodate.
No, so the actual part, I'm less worried about it, because you could say somehow licenses the use of a demonstrative as an alternative.
Yeah, maybe.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess the important point is that just basic general knowledge is never enough. You really need.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and it might be something about having these like other expressions floating around in the discourse, as opposed to you're trying to infer something from the same sentence that two is attached to. Maybe maybe that's a factor as well, but I don't know. Yes, we have to look into this a bit more. But thank you that I think about this.
Okay, and I don't see any other new hands going up, and I do have another question, so let me go ahead and.
Oh, wow, okay.
I'm sorry, but this is stuff that I used to really work on a lot.
Sorry, somehow jury is in focus. Is this
You've got a question. Jury is. I'm sorry.
I see.
Yeah, but I also think that Joe also raised hand. But okay, could I ask my question? So I wanted to ask about 29. James or Danielle danced. Katie danced too.
Sorry. Oh yeah. This one?
Oh, 29.
Can you get it on the screen? For some reason, you're stuck on page 37.
Okay, that's weird. I don't know why this is happening. This.
Oh yes. So is Danielle here supposed to be a male name? So I just wondered if Danielle was a.
Sorry, yeah. So Daniela is. So this is like, this is just like an internal joke. We all went to. So Katie, James, Daniela, and Flora, and I went to this summer school. So yeah, Daniela is this Italian man.
Okay. So I just wondered if Danielle was a girl, then would the relevant alternative to be considered be like he or she dance? So in that case,
right,
it's not just one word. So you have to construct something like a little.
That's a very good point indeed. Yeah. I guess like in English, you could potentially say they.
Yeah.
And in other languages like German, I suppose you could say he as like a gender neutral pronoun. But yeah, in the case where you don't have a gender neutral version, but so that's a good point, because like with an inanimate, you usually can't really do this. So like either James or like, some company own the stocks. Of some other company. Here I guess you could say they actually, so that's not a good example. But yeah, okay, so that's maybe yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good point. I have to come up with a good example, but that's indeed a worry.
Joe, do you have a question too? Yes, go.
Hi, I had another question for you. It's kind of related to the statement about where you just need the listener to be able to figure out what the what the antecedent is. And I was thinking about like the kind of the difference with written text. So like a lot of times with writing, you can have two sentences and use an additive particle like also. And for a reader, the additive particle seems inappropriate because they can't pick up something. So like, for example, you could say, Russia entered, Russia entered Ukraine. Also, Bitcoin's price went down. And so if you don't know the relationship between Bitcoin and Russia, then the also would seem incredibly out of place. And so I think the problem there would be thinking of an appropriate set of alternatives, I guess, like things, recent news involving Russia or something like that. And so in that case, like there can't really be any indexical element. And so like what like your explanation seemed very appropriate to me, but then what Chris said also seemed to suggest that there's something else. So I was wondering if maybe there's like a difference between written text and spoken text or something.
Good. So I think that your example, what's going on in your example is sort of a discourse use of also, and this is part of the reason why I wanted to focus on two, because two usually doesn't allow this kind of use that freely. So one way to think about this is that if in the second sentence here, you have everything in focus, like everything is like focused, and then you have also attached to it. And what you're trying to do is identify an alternative sentence that's true, that's presupposed to be true, which you can find, which is the first sentence here. And the entire thing is a salient expression, so you can just derive it. But that's probably not enough because, like you said, you have to somehow figure out the relation between the two sentences. Like there's an additional sort of component that these two sentences are sort of addressing the same QUD, if that's the right way to say it. Right? So there's some kind of pragmatic relation between the two. And that needs to be, I think, encoded either in the semantics of also, or in this construction where also appears in a very high position. Maybe it's modifying a speech act, for example, right? So like something like, look, this speech act of asserting the second sentence is also, it's not true, but relevant and true, or something like that. So something needs to be said. I don't think it's a very easy matter for us to analyze it, but that's roughly the thought I have at the moment. And just to mention, this intuition, I think, is exactly what Kripke had originally, actually. Right? So when he said the additive presupposition is anaphoric, and sorry, this is not the right one. I don't know if I'm sharing the right screen. When he said the additive presupposition is always a propositional anaphora, I think what he had in mind, that's my reading of his paper anyway, or speech, because it was a talk, I guess, originally. You somehow identify like a relevant discourse flow, and then you have to find a sort of parallel utterance that's known to be true. So the case of also in this kind of use, I think, is very similar to what Kripke said, but we want to understand it in terms of, our theory, in terms of our theory of focus alternatives, instead of using a propositional pronoun. But yeah, we have to work it out. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and squeeze in my last question really quick. The way you have it analyzed is roughly focus accommodation feeding into the interpretation of two, which has its own presuppositions, right? And so you expect that two can at worst make things harder. But what you find is in the New York example, even when you and I are sitting there eating in New York, it's very easy to do the accommodation when you have to, but very difficult to do it with the exact same sentence without to.
I see, yeah.
So the question is, what is that telling us? I have a feeling that what it's telling us is that there is no such thing as just bare focus, that you always have to have something that is adding something like the way to is. And that something is indicated intonationally in English. So you could have a final form, which means contrast. And here you don't have any contrast. Or you could have a continuation rise, which means that something is under is a question under discussion, and you don't have any question under discussion. But it strongly suggests that you do not have the sentence as analyzed in the to example without the word to. That would just have this bare focus that says accommodates what you need to accommodate. You have to have something.
Okay, so I think two things here. Firstly, about these two things, there's accommodation of alternatives and then the presupposition. So we actually don't see this as like a sequential procedure where A precedes B. Rather, yes. So yeah, we kind of see, so we haven't really specified how exactly accommodation happens. But our thought here is that by knowing that the consequence of accommodating a focus alternative has an effect on the additive presupposition actually helps you identify what's the relevant focus alternative. So B kind of feeds back to A in a way, or you use B core linguistic knowledge in order to resolve A, and maybe potentially vice versa, but if you have to accommodate this part. But okay, so that's our sort of the view of how this thing actually happens. And with respect to, so it's not necessarily the case that having two makes things harder. Maybe actually that somehow make it easier because you're indicating what the intended inference is going to be very clearly. Namely, it's going to be an additive presupposition, right? And then with respect to cases without two, I don't know what to say. I mean, some people have remarked that in some cases that you really have to have two. Like there's no way of omitting it. And certainly I want to understand it, but I mean, one possibility is, I mean, in a way, like you said, the version without two has some inference that you don't want to derive, right? So that practically forces the use of a two. Yeah, how to cash that out is an important question here, I guess. Like, why is it that what looks like free focus has a different interpretation? I don't have a lot to say about that at the moment, but if you have thoughts. So some people have said that this is the anti-presupposition effect derived from the fact that you could say two, and the fact that you didn't say two somehow forces you to have a different interpretation. Maybe that's what's going on, maybe not. I'm kind of neutral at the moment about that issue, but yeah. So, but good point, good point.